Hello and welcome to another tutorial on LaTeX for Java developers. In this tutorial, I'm going to continue our discussion on creating a LaTeX renderer in Java, and we discuss why the LaTeX renderer might need to run more than one time, or basically why it needs to run the LaTeX typesetter that we choose, for example, pdflatex more than one times, right? So the constructor of a LaTeX renderer class can take the name of the typesetter that we want to run and feed our text file to it, and then the number of runs, right? And obviously we can have a no arg constructor that has default values, which is pdflatex and then one number of runs. And then the main method inside the LaTeX renderer is going to be a render method, right? That is going to create our document class, issue this command to LaTeX, add the packages that we want to add any extra preamble, add the main text, which is inside the document environment, run command line, call pdflatex, feed the text file to it, and basically here it has to also create the text file and save it, and then clean up auxiliary files if we don't want to keep them, right? So the render method should call pdflatex from the command line. We can have a set output path to tell LaTeX render where to save our text file, and then set output name to set the name of the text file, which is by default is going to be the name of the PDF file as well. So a typesetter can be run multiple times. Typically this is required when we need to create table of contents or any bibliography, referencing equations, anything, right? Because the first time LaTeX passes through your text file, it sees if needs to create an auxiliary file. If so, it creates one, but then in the second run it goes through the auxiliary file and executes all the commands inside the auxiliary file. So here now we have to figure out how to run. So let's say our LaTeX renderer creates the text file for us, but then the question is, how do we feed it to the pdflatex from inside Java, right? So in order to do that, we know that so far we've been running the pdflatex from the command line, right? From the command line, and then basically now we have to figure out how to run pdflatex from within Java. And in order to do that, right, we must somehow access the runtime environment of the operating system. So each operating system provides an interface to its command line or terminal or shell or bash or whatever, right? And as you know, Java is all about abstraction. So the main goal of Java is to abstract away the platform for you. Platform means the operating system plus the CPU architecture, 32-bit, 64-bit, or the operating system, Windows, Linux, Mac OS, etc., right? So in Java we have this abstraction through the runtime class, and it's a singleton design pattern. So per JVM, whenever you run a JVM, there is only one instance of the runtime, which makes sense because there is no point of creating more than one instance. Runtime is implemented as a singleton design pattern and has a private constructor. So if you're not familiar with what the singleton design pattern is when we have a singleton design pattern, we make the constructor private. We create a private static final field. Here it's called current runtime, right? It's of the same type, which is runtime. And then we create a method, a public static method, get instance, or here it's called get runtime. And then we typically do lazy initialization. So unless somebody calls this get runtime, this current runtime field is null. When somebody calls this for the first time, we initialize it, but in the next run, in the next call of get runtime, we don't reinitialize, we just return the reference, right? And this current runtime is private static final, so we're returning the reference to this. But in some cases we might end up with escaping references. So even though this current runtime, which is the instance of this runtime class, might be final, it might have a state that the user may be able to change. But here, just by looking at the runtime class, we see that there is no state here. So the user cannot mutate this even though this is final, right? So it has some methods, some package level access method, so it doesn't really have any state, right? It has a version field which is a static final, so the user cannot access it, right? So the interaction of the user with runtime is only through methods, public methods. And as you can see, there are a few native methods. If you don't know what native method is, you can go and check all my lectures on Java native interface to understand how the native methods work, right? So we call runtime get runtime to get this static final field. Current runtime, right, gives the only instance of the runtime per JVM. Even you are running JVM and your application is multi-threaded, you will still get one basically runtime. Must make sure Eclipse can access path environment variable. What do I mean by that? So typically, for example, in your Mac operating system, if you download the Eclipse IDE and double click its icon in the application folder, it runs it, but then Eclipse, from within Eclipse, if we launch a terminal, we don't see the path environment variable. It's not aware of that. That's why I typically run my Eclipse from the command line or terminal. So the command for it in Mac OS is something like this. You want to open an application Eclipse, but because right now I'm not in my applications folder, I can say -a, which means try to search this application anywhere. -a means anywhere in the operating system, not inside this current working directory, right? And that's how Eclipse can macOS can open Eclipse from terminal. And whenever you run an application from terminal, your bash profile and bash RC, bash resources, are already appended your path. So right now in my home directory and in each basically in Unix operating system like macOS or Linux, you have this idea of bash profile, and these are hidden files. Bash profile, if I hit tab, so bash RC, so we have bash RC and dot bash underscore profile. Bash is just this shell command, which is bash. And if you're using any other type of shell like ZSH, then you have .zsh underscore ZSHRC or .zsh underscore profile. And the purpose of these files, these are just text files, and you can manipulate your path environment variables in these. The idea here is that you can customize your bash because bash is where you run your for example applications, right? And in order for bash to be able to run application, it has to be able to find them, right? And we said that that's one of the goals of the path environment variable, that allows you to allows the bash or the terminal or the shell command line to search for executables, binaries. All right. So pdflatex must be found on the path. I mean, later I'll show you ways to circumvent this, and one of the ways is we define system arguments or system properties for the JVM, Java Virtual Machine, when we launch the application. And you may already be familiar with things like -d parameters that you pass to the JVM. For example, you say Java execute this main class, right? Main class. And then before that you can say system argument java dot -d are system arguments that you can pass. For example, we can define in such a way that when we launch our application, we append the pdflatex path to it. So -d pdflatex equals whatever path, and then we run our Java application main class, right? And what happens here is that then we can take advantage of this system JVM system property. So which pdflatex, I can copy this, and if we don't want to force the users to make sure that the pdflatex is on their path, we can say that they can set up this environment or Java JVM system parameter, let's say pdflatex or any type of LaTeX typesetter, and then they can run the application main class, right? So what happens is that when JVM runs, it understands this parameter, a system variable or system parameter, which starts with -d or a system property, and it understands that there is a variable called LaTeX, and here's its a string value. So all the system parameters are tokenized based on the strings. The equality sign -d tells JVM this is a system property, and anything between d and equal sign is the name of the variable, and anything after that until you hit a space is the value. So this is like a key value pair. So you can imagine that then this is going to be stored in a hash map, which is exactly what happens in Java, and I'll show you in the coming lectures, and how these system properties work in Java, how we can set them up and retrieve the values. So if you don't want to make this assumption that the PDF LaTeX or any LaTeX typesetter can be found on the environment variable, we can also implement this functionality with system property -d so that the user can set it up, right? In macOS, you can run Eclipse IDE from terminal, open the name of the application, but then if you're not in the application folder, you can use -a, means search for this application anywhere. -a means from anywhere. And then what happens here is that then we can use the execute methods in the runtime. So you see we have some public method, execute a string, execute a string, array of strings, execute a string, array of strings, and a file. Execute array of strings, execute a string, array of a string, a string array, execute array of a string, array of a string, and file, right? And these all help you execute shell commands or terminal commands. And these are again platform independent. So you can use them to run terminal commands in Windows, macOS, and Linux. So when I say shell command, for example, you can, let's say you want to execute this command, which PDF LaTeX, right? This is a command that we are executing, and what happens here is that this which is already on the path environment variable. It's an application. So this application runs, and then this is the argument that is passed to this application, to which application. When I say application, it means it's an executable binary. When I run it, it executes, it returns some results to the console, which is interpreted as text or a string, right? That's why all these executes have return some object called process. And this process is hooked up to your terminal or your operating system console, because whenever you run a executable or application in terminal or in the command line, operating system allocates a standard input and output to it so that the user can interact and see the results of execution, or if the execution requires some extra parameters from the user, then the user can input. So whenever you run a executable or you run a command through the terminal or command line, the operating system allocates the standard input stream, a standard output stream, and also a standard error, right? So this process, you can imagine that this process can handle this allocation and can provide an interface to those standard input and output in Java. And that's exactly what happens. This process has a method called get input stream, get output stream, and you can use that to monitor the output of your execution, the result, right? So use execute method to execute commands, and these return a process, and this process or each process has an input stream and output stream, and these are hooked up to the standard input and output of the operating system that was allocated to your executed command, right? Input stream means it's a stream into your JVM, your Java code. So you have to be careful here. It's a little bit different from a standard input, right? So when in terminal, the standard input means that it's from the user, the text that the user puts to the terminal, to the operating system. The standard output for terminal is from the operating system to the terminal, so that some text is printed and the user can see it. But with this process inside the Java and JVM, the input stream, this is input stream into your JVM, from operating system to JVM. Read the results. That means you can the input stream of this process is what you can use to see what's the result, what's the output of your when you executed this command. Output stream is from JVM to operating system, right? Add some input to the terminal. Okay, so I hope this is clear, and let's head to Eclipse and try to have a look at this and see how we can execute any terminal command in Java, right? So back to Eclipse, I have this class called test terminal, and let's have a main method here. And the very first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to use a public static void test1, and in test1 I'm going to do exactly what I've been doing. So let's say I want to see which PDF LaTeX, right? Where the PDF LaTeX is and whether it's on the path or not. So there are two ways to check if PDF LaTeX is on the path. So approach one for checking PDF LaTeX or any other type of LaTeX typesetter on a path environment variable. Approach one is we just execute this which command. So we execute the which application, and we feed it this PDF LaTeX argument, and it tries to searches the path and tries to see if it can find this application. So what we're going to do is let's create a string LaTeX, or okay, so I'm going to get my runtime. Runtime is a runtime class from Java lang get runtime, and again it's basically a singleton, and we can just use var here, and then sysout runtime, and I believe this will return the version. No, it's just a Java object. So runtime has a static method called version, so we can check which version of the Java we're using. So let's see 15 and 1, right? So this is a Java 15. So sometimes if your application is not compatible with previous versions, you can basically check here. And then what can we do with runtime? Let's say I want to execute a command. So approach one is to execute the which command. So command is which, and then the PDF LaTeX, right? Which is a binary application in the operating system, which macOS and Linux have it. I actually don't know if Linux has it, but I am positive that it probably has. So a string command is which PDF LaTeX, something like that, and then we're going to say runtime execute, and know that these are not static methods, right? These are non-static methods, and this is our command, right? And then this throws an exception, IO exception, so surround with try catch. And then what this execute returns is a process, right? Execute the specific string command in a separate process. This is a convenience method, and invocation from the exec command behaves exactly the same way as exec command null null. And we will look at the other variations of this exec command. So this returns a process. So, and again, the job of the process is to handle the interaction with the console from within the Java or from within the JVM, and that's basically the standard input and output. And we know that this P has a input stream, get input stream, and we can hook this up to a buffered input stream or whatever. And for convenience, I'm just going to use a scanner here, a scanner, new scanner, and the scanner can be hooked up to any input stream. So I use the input stream from the process, right? And then I'm going to say while a scanner has, so now I want to see what's the output. So I want to read the output of the process, which is feed to Java using the input stream of the process, right? Remember, this input stream is taking the results of the standard output of the console that is allocated by the operating system. And it's an input from the operating system to your JVM, to your Java. A scanner dot while a scanner has next line, I'm going to do a sysout on the scanner next line, right? I'm going to read the output line by line. So let's see. And as you can see, it was able to find the PDF LaTeX, and this is exactly the same as okay, let me close this, also close this one. This is exactly the result as what we get on the terminal. So that's how we can execute terminal commands, right? So we use runtime class, which is a singleton. So runtime is a singleton class, and then basically one instance per JVM. And with this runtime, we can execute terminal commands, right? Because that's the whole point of this runtime class. It's an abstraction of your native operating system's terminal or runtime, right? You can run anything and do anything from the terminal, and that's the same thing here. For example, right now, let's say I want to create a document, right? So create a folder in create a new folder. So the terminal command is mkdir, and we can do exactly that with this runtime. So let me just quickly show you that. Again, any command that you can run in your terminal in operating system, you can use the runtime and execute to do that. So I'm going to say mkdir make directory testing, and then now the key here is that where is this command running from? So we know that basically the idea in terminals is you are always inside some directory, and that's your pwd, right? Print working directory. And let's maybe first try that, pwd. And if you are familiar with Eclipse and how it runs Java applications, you know that when you look at your run configuration, you see Eclipse, the default working directory is workspace location and the project location. So in Eclipse, for Java projects, by default, the working directory of your JVM or Java application when it runs, it's your Java project, and that's most likely, I guess that's what we're going to see when we execute this command. Yes, this is our Java project, right? So in Eclipse, and that's you have to be careful about this because this is just a property of Eclipse, right? Eclipse sets up the working directory so that it sets it to the project folder. And actually JVM has a system property user directory, and from that you can see, I guess, what your working directory is, or you can set the working directory. And let's also quickly look at that. Public static void test3. Okay. In test3, I'm going to use the system class get property, right? And then user.dir, and then this returns all these property stuff are strings, right? dir, and then let's do a sysout on this, sysout dir. Let's see what's the user directory. And again, the same thing. So basically, when Eclipse runs, it sets this directory, it sets this property, because system also has a set property, and we can say user directory to something else, right? The value can be anything else. And then after that, your working directory changes. So Eclipse sets this property inside the JVM so that your working directory becomes the project folder that you're currently in, right? So now that we executed pwd, and then we can use mkdir testing, and this is going to create a folder inside our project test LaTeX project at the top level. And as you can see, it's done, and now the folder is there. And again, you can do exactly the same thing with the terminal. So if I select this and then open a terminal at my project, let me close the previous one and clear mkdir testing, and it's done. And if we refresh, we see. So that's how we can use we can execute any terminal command from Java, right? We get the runtime, we use the exec function, the one that takes a plain text, which is the full command, or the one that has other variations. For example, it takes a string of arrays, etc., string arrays. But this is the one, the exec, that takes only a string as a full command, is the typical use case. And obviously you can assume that what we're going to do with pdflatex, what we're going to do, we're going to just call the pdflatex on the name of the file, right? So maybe let me just create a new a test here, test 4, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to just show you what we've been doing so far on the terminal, running a pdflatex and feeding it a text file, right? So what we're going to do, so basically we're going to here create a string var is pdflatex and the text file, let's say it's let's also delete these. Now the problem here is that we know that the working directory is from basically let me just delete this and I'll show you. So the working directory is set to the project folder. So even if I run pdflatex on these, so pdflatex, what happens here is that we want to feed it to from the working directory. I'm using a relative path to LaTeX tutorials, right? And then I want to go into tutorial_5 and running on tutorial5.tech, right? Now the problem here is that if I run this, because the working directory is still let's call this command, the working directory is still top level, the output of pdflatex, which is all this pdf and auxiliary file, is going to be put inside this test latex for J project, not inside the tutorial5 folder. So let's try this. As you can see, when we execute the command, this is the same thing that we've already been familiar with, right? And as you can see, the output was put inside the working directory, and that's the problem, right? So how can we fix this? Let's see if we can try and change the working directory, system.setProperty, and then user dir, and then we're going to say it's we kind of need to get the absolute path here. Let's just copy this one. All right, and after setting this, I'm going to try to basically change the command to just tutorial5, and then let's add the semicolon here. So what I'm doing here, I'm trying to set the property, and I think this is not going to work because when I run application, Eclipse automatically changes this. So I guess this is not going to work. Yeah, I can't find tutorial5 because the working directory is set to this by Eclipse, right? And so basically, usually when we have a Java application, we already ask the user where the basically the text file is. So here I'm just manually setting it up, but usually we either have a GUI, a file chooser that we choose the file path, or we have some option or a method or something to set the absolute path of the file, right? So this was the idea behind running Java basically operating systems applications from the terminal, and how we can do the same thing in Java. So to recap, we use the runtime class that has execute methods, and we create the command as a string, and the command is passed to the execute, and the return is a process, and the process abstracts away or models any native process that is running. And native processes can interact with the user through input and output to the terminal, right? They input text, or they output text to the terminal, or they input text from the user. They ask for some parameters. And we say the output of the console, which is printed to the terminal, is hooked up to the JVM by this input stream, and the input stream of the process means the output of the process from the operating system to the JVM. That's why it's called the input stream, because it's input to the JVM. And then we can use a class such as a scanner, and its input can be hooked to any input stream, right? A scanner is just a buffer that reads text and then we can hook it up to the input stream, and then we can read the output of the execution line by line. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.